Oh dear, it seems like I've gotten myself lost in the background. If there's only a video that went over some tips and tricks on how I can help separate and make myself stand out from the background. Hi. So there are actually some things that you can do to help your subject stand out from the... So there actually are some things that we can do to help our subject stand out from the background that we can do actually in both production and in post-production. But since we're here, let's start with production. So the main three things that we can do is color contrast, exposure contrast, and depth of field. With color contrast, what that's going to do is we want to have a different color from the background. We want the background to be a different color from our subject. But if your subject is wearing a blue shirt or something that is close to the same hue, color, saturation of the background, they may kind of blend in with it. Where if you do something that's on the opposite color scale, that will help your subject pop out more from the background. The next thing we'll have is exposure contrast. So what we want to do is we want to make sure the background is darker than our subject. This will help our subject stand out more. So either if you do have a backlight, drop the intensity of it so it's not as bright and it brings down the brightness and makes it darker than the background, or you can just turn off the backlight entirely. Now, if you're in a case where you go, I still need the backlight on because I want to showcase my lamp that's not on and my salt lamp that's not on and a bunch of books that frankly aren't even real. So something you can incorporate that I've even talked about in previous videos is you can introduce a hair light. So a hair light will help your subject stand out more from the background. That's something that's going to create a rim right around your hair, shoulder, and create that separation from you in the background. And something else that you can do is not just maybe use a daylight or tungsten light, but you can use RGB or gels to use a different color to help, like I said, create more of that separation. I realize now, looking, my background is so absolutely bland and boring, especially since I knocked down both trees. It's just something I noticed right now, but it doesn't matter. It's fine. And one of the last things that we can do in production is to use more shallow depth of field. So this will help keep that background a little bit more blurred where our subject is more sharp. Now, how can you use this? Well, one of the first things we do is to use a lower aperture, so that way your lens is more open, you're able to have a shallower depth of field, I guess, as I've already said. Or if you don't have a lens that get down to f1.8, 2.8, 3, 3.5, what have you, you can also have your subject move further from the background. That'll create more of that separation. That'll help you create that blur, that bokeh, bokeh, that's wrong. I don't know why I said it like that. But yes, so those are some of the main things that you can do in production is color contrast, exposure contrast, and shallow depth of field. Depth of field. Now, let's get into the editing side of things. Whee! So how can you make your subject stand out or bring more focus to them during post-production? Well, a lot of these tips, although I'm using Adobe Premiere, can be used in almost universally any editing software. So one of the first things I usually love to do is I love to create a vignette. Now a vignette will be a dark or bright color at the edge of the frame that starts at maybe a higher opacity and then drops down to 0, so that way it gradually will bring focus to your subject. Now you can play with the vignette, such as the shape of it. You can play with the feather amount, the midpoint, how deep it goes, how small it is. These are all tools you can play with, and it's all going to be personal preference, but I think a vignette is a great way to help bring a little bit more focus to your subject. Another tool that I like to use is to mask my subject. So I'll usually create an oval or circle just around the subject. And now with this, as we talked about during production, we talked about color contrast, depth of field, and exposure contrast, is that we can kind of play with that with this mask. So we can go ahead and drop the exposure to make the background darker from our subject. We can go ahead and change a little bit of maybe the color temperature or colors. And obviously, since we didn't get the color in production, it may look a little off. So just be aware that you don't want to get too crazy, especially since there's going to be that part in the mask that's not being affected. Now, to help maybe smooth out this is to increase the feather of it. And when you increase the feather, you'll be able to see how much it affects of the frame itself. We can also add a blur effect, so that way we can bring back some of that shallow depth of field that maybe we didn't capture in camera at the time. Now remember, this isn't going to affect everything in the background similar to the shallow depth field in camera. It's going to affect everything. So you have something in the foreground, the background, the midground, even the subject itself, depending on where your mask is, And that's where we'll want to increase that feather so that way it's a more gradual, so it's not so sharp and it really stands out to us. So I think just a little bit goes a long way. Now, something else you can do is if you want to avoid the mask where maybe it, has part of the hand that's now in the blur or the darker background or the darkness, the different colors, what we can do is we can bring this into After Effects, or you can mask completely in Premiere, though I think After Effects will be a little bit easier, and you can rotoscope your subject. So that way you can paint them out completely from the background. Now, this is something that I think is a really cool feature and something that can add something fun to the video, but I don't think it's something that's maybe worth to remove your subject from the whole entire video, unless of course there is something totally wrong in the background or you really need it fixed to help separate them, make them stand out. I think using the rotoscope is fun to add like text or throw them in a different background, but I think to adjust something for the whole video, maybe not worth the time. I mean, obviously it depends on each project, but it's my opinion. So hopefully these tips, tricks will help you learn how to separate and make your subject stand out more from the background. So we will see you next time.